So the report last week has to do with the North Korea summit that's coming up on June 12th. Purportedly, obviously, it's difficult to tell in any given instance whether Trump's assurance that a summit is actually going to go forward is something that we should take as 100% serious, although the diplomatic wheels do seem to be in motion where we should now, I think, treat the summit as something that is going to be happening in some form on the 12th. Um, in that spirit, I wanted to take a look at some of the key personnel on the American side who are actually playing an integral role in creating the groundwork on which this summit is going to rest. Because it's not just a matter of Trump and Kim showing up in Singapore and having a meeting. There's a ton of lower level work that goes into actually bringing about a summit like this. And some of those key personnel are going to be within the National Security Council. And John Bolton was nominated or installed by Trump to be the new National Security Advisor now a couple months ago. And when that happened, Bolton brought in a number of his longtime political associates to undertake key roles in the transition process. So when you have a new national security advisor coming in, also there is a new wave of personnel coming in, and Bolton needed people to manage that process for him. So naturally, because Bolton for years had operated this kind of constellation of political organizations, he was able to draw on people who populated those organizations to occupy key roles in this transition endeavor. And one of those people is a man called Charles Kupperman. And Kupperman is somebody who has been in the hawkish think tank world for quite some time and who has been an associate of Bolton's. And now, at least as of a couple days ago, as a federal government job, basically taking in resumes of people who want to work for the National Security Council, sifting through them, and presumably offering recommendations about who Bolton should hire. So this job, as the New York Times reported, is supposed to be temporary. It's a matter of just him managing this transition. But nevertheless, Kupperman, if he's the one receiving resumes from people who want to work for the National Security Council, he has a very important job at a very crucial juncture, seeing as this summit is only about a week away. So Kupperman is involved in actually putting into place the personnel who are going to be presiding over kind of the policy framework leading up to this summit. Now, to what extent Trump is reliant on policy framework to do what he wants to do, that's an open question. Perhaps it's just all improvisational on his part, and the policy mechanisms aren't quite as relevant. But nevertheless, it's important to take a look at who these people are. So Kupperman, while he has this temporary government role, working for the National Security Council as the person through whom resumes go of prospective National Security Council employees, TYT Investigates, I reported last week that Kupperman is simultaneously maintaining an active role on a think tank that is one of the premier hawkish think tanks in Washington, D.C. It's called the National Institute for Public Policy. Very benign, banal sounding name, but nevertheless, it's sort of a clearinghouse for all manner of hawkish policy prescriptions, and in that sense is actually much more significant than what the name implies. Now, it's not a big surprise that somebody who has an affiliation with Bolton for all these years wouldn't be a member of a hawkish institution, but what really matters, I think, in this particular context is that the National Institute for Public Policy proudly proclaims that one of its premier funders is Raytheon. Raytheon, as you may know, is one of the biggest defense contractors in the country, and one of its big market areas is producing these missile interception systems for different countries, so that they may be protected against any kind of incoming ballistic missile fire. And of course, that's the big threat that North Korea supposedly poses. So Raytheon has a vested interest economically so it's able to market its wares, having as much geopolitical tension as possible in the Korean Peninsula, because that way it'll be able to better market its very expensive and very profitable weapons defense systems. In fact, the head of the National Institute for Public Policy in the past has written op-eds claiming that the Korean situation is not conducive to diplomacy. Diplomacy has failed, and that the best way to handle this situation is to merely invest in expanded missile systems developed by Raytheon. And Raytheon, of course, funds his think tank, where senior fellows and senior scholars and people with these kind of amorphous titles are able to have this sheen of a kind of academic legitimacy and create all these kinds of reports and policy papers and so forth that universally prescribe a hawkish posture toward all the world's problems. And so the bottom line is Charles Kupperman is, as we were able to confirm, has an active role on the board of this institution that is funded by Raytheon. And Raytheon, if you look at just raw economic self-interest, would like to see continued tensions as high as possible with North Korea, and a peace deal would not necessarily be in their economic self-interest. So you have to wonder, what is the role of somebody like Kupperman and actually in the background as we lead up to this summit? Does he have any interests beyond simply staffing the National Security Council that may actually impel him to maybe hire somebody who has a desire to scuttle the deal in some way? I mean, we can't draw an actual line of causation here necessarily, but if this is the person who has like a tangible, conflict of interest, who is staffing the National Security Council at a key juncture, it makes you wonder: if Trump is genuine that he wants to achieve a peace accord, does he have the personnel in place that's actually going to make that viable? So there's more. There are more details in the article, which was linked to under this video. And now I'm going to take some comments here. I see some of them appearing on my screen. Who would apply at this point to work in the White House? Someone with a kind heart or Stephen Miller? Seems like a dangerous pool. Well, I mean, you would apply in the White House. You would apply to work in the White House if you're sort of a mid-career to beginning career individual who wants to have job prospects later on in the defense sector, because regardless of whether Trump has a good reputation personally, the fact that you worked in the White House is going to be a great resume builder. It's going to essentially guarantee you job prospects later on, irrespective of how his presidency pans out. So it's career-minded operative types who want that kind of that title on their resume, who are seeking to work for the White House. The places that they would want to work in the future, defense contractors, the think tanks, various private sector interests which have some kind of crossover correlation with the defense industry. None of these organizations are necessarily going to hold it against you for working against Trump. And in fact, it might be a boon, because they see him as somebody who has done the defense industry a great service by seeking to increase defense spending and basically seeking military solutions for many problems. That's level 3 of trying to tank this summit. I'm not sure I exactly understand that question. I think the level that my article dealt with was, I guess, what you might call level 1, in terms of the personnel who don't have a large profile, who are actually involved in the inner workings of how the summit will actually operate. Level 2, I guess you could say, if we're going with this metaphor, is the figureheads at the top. So Trump, Kim, Moon, people in their kind of inner circle. And level three, I mean, I guess it would sort of go back to what I was saying before. Level three, I think you could characterize as the just the domestic political climate in all the countries involved here. So on the one hand, in South Korea, all the polling seems to indicate that the people are very much in favor of what Moon, the president, has attempted to do, because Moon is this figure who came into office after the impeachment of his predecessor, who went through a very tumultuous corruption scandal, and Moon was sort of a unifying political force there, and is somebody who has pretty extremely high levels of support. It's sort of akin to what George W. Bush's support was after 9/11. So he has a political base there that is overwhelming in terms of the agenda he's trying to promote. Whereas in the U.S., I mean, Trump is relatively unpopular. There's a ton of polarization. Anything Trump does is going to be seen through the prism of his very divisive domestic political profile. So that there's nowhere near the unity, quote unquote, that the South Korean president is currently enjoying. And I think domestic politics always influences foreign policy. It's just a truism of international relations theory. So that, I think, is another level on which this peace summit could be scuttled. And then level 4, another kind of level are the business interests, and that's sort of what we tried to look at in part in this article. Raytheon, for all of its kind of PR material portraying itself as a company which has the best interests of American national security at its center, it would very, very obviously benefit from the failure of this peace summit, because it wants to sell its products. I mean, it wants to deliver for its shareholders, and a reduction in tensions in South Korea, one of its big markets, is not going to be conducive to that goal. In fact, just last year, and this is mentioned in the article, Raytheon debuted a new missile interception system that is modeled on the Israeli Iron Dome system. Now, the effectiveness of the Israeli Iron Dome system is sort of in doubt if you actually look at the studies of that system, but it's gotten a ton of American funding, and Israel touts it as the leading defense providing missile defense system in the world. And Raytheon had hoped to kind of export that technology to other contexts, one of which, as many analysts speculated, could have been South Korea if things had gone on the trajectory that they seem to be going on a couple months ago. But now, with this a relatively stark shift in relations there, Raytheon is not necessarily shouldn't necessarily feel happy about that from, again, a raw economic self-interest perspective. So that's why one of the ways to sort of report on this summit is to look at people who might be trying to serve the interests of those defense contracting firms, and trying to nudge policy in a particular direction. The military industrial complex is so buried into our government, they do not want peace. I mean, again, look at the stock prices of Raytheon, and this is mentioned in the article. The day that Trump sent that sort of impetuous letter to Kim, and regretfully stating that he would be canceling the summit, Raytheon's stock price went up pretty significantly. Then, a couple days later, a week later, whenever that was exactly, Trump says the Korea summit is back on. Lo and behold, the Raytheon stock price dips. Now, what does that tell you? It's pretty self-explanatory. And that's why, one of the reporting imperatives that I think is most relevant in lead up to this story is to see people who are working to further the interests of these military industrial complex firms. To what extent are they actually overriding what Trump at least says on the surface is the objective here, which is to achieve a peace accord. So that was one of the reasons I was motivated to look into that aspect. In conclusion, as the summit approaches, and again, this is a pretty historic moment. I mean, think about it. The Korean War was 70 years ago. People didn't even know that it was still ongoing technically. Um, and if it could end, it pretty drastic. It would, seemingly, if you look at what the South Korean analysts are saying, if it were to end, it would seemingly change the way that we think about North Korea as a geopolitical issue for the foreseeable future. Then again, knowing Trump, it could all blow up and end disastrously. So it's a pretty crucial juncture here, and that's why I thought that rather than kind of sitting around and trying to psychoanalyze Trump, which I guess again is unavoidable sometimes, one way to look at this from a journalistic perspective is to analyze the interests that the personnel who are involved at a policymaking level are motivated by. Like this Bolton associate who, while he's working for the federal government, has no compunction about maintaining an external affiliation with a think tank funded by Raytheon, which wants to continue selling missile defense systems as a result of fears around North Korea. So, I mean, the conflict there is just kind of pretty self-evident. So stuff along those lines I think is worth keeping an eye on, and we'll see what transpires. So thank you for joining this live stream, and I will see you later.